Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here this morning. I want to, first of all, commend the Levy Economics Institute for holding this conference. The topic could not be more timely given the many cross-currents that we're seeing in the Eurozone right now. First of all, signs of optimism that things might be turning around, but at the same time, a lot of concern about what is happening on the ground and to many of the citizens, particularly in Southern Europe, who have yet to see the fruits of some of the more positive economic figures that have been coming out recently. I'm Liz Alderman. I'm the European economics correspondent for the New York Times. I have been reporting on the European economic crisis for several years now, and I have been to Greece many times, as well as to many of the other Southern European countries. So this conference and this panel in particular is one of great interest to me. We do have a distinguished members on our panel this morning who I'm pretty sure you're going to learn a lot by listening to them. But it is true that 5 years after the Eurozone crisis began, the topic of this panel, which is Europe at a Crossroads, is extremely timely. Europe is at a crossroads. The big question is whether we are truly past the worst. And that is an issue that is jumping to the forefront once again, especially after the European Central Bank surprised a lot of people by cutting interest rates yesterday. Has austerity, as Dimitri asked, as controversial as it has been, in fact helped put countries on the path toward greater fiscal rectitude, or has it left a scar so deep that it will take us longer to rebound than anticipated? Our panelists today are going to be examining those issues. In particular, they will be focusing on the paradox facing the continent right now. As I mentioned, confidence seems to have returned, and the long recession on the periphery appears to be turning a corner. Up north in Ireland, which was the first country to be bailed out during this crisis, the country in December is set to become the first to actually exit its international support. Spain has finally officially crawled out of a 2-year recession, and in Greece, there are forecasts that growth will actually return next year after this country lost a staggering 25% of its gross domestic product in the last 6 years. Despite these positive signs, many nations, as well as their citizens, have yet to see a significant improvement in the real economy. One has only to walk out of the doors of this building and start talking to any person on the street, or in Ireland, Spain, Portugal, or even France for that matter, to get a sense of the disconnect between a brightening of the official statistics and what is really happening on the ground. As Dimitri noted, unemployment is also growing worse, especially for Europe's youth, and long-term joblessness has become a serious issue, one that has the potential to fuel social strife in certain countries and even political extremism. The considerable social challenges have also turned into political ones that mean structural reforms continue to lag. Massive debt, as you will hear our panelists discuss in just a moment, still menaces the recovery. And Europe as a whole is still running at 2 different speeds. Mario Draghi, the head of the European Central Bank, reiterated yesterday that the risks to the Eurozone remain on the downside. I am hoping that our panel will be able to paint a somewhat brighter picture of this. And I'm looking forward to hearing their expert advice on the policy actions that are needed to stabilize the situation and to avoid any economic relapse. So without further ado, let me introduce all of them. To my left, Philippe Gudin de Vallerin, who's the managing director and chief European economist of Barclays. He's a very interesting figure because he was also the former chairman of France's Economic Policy Committee at the French Finance Committee, where he worked very closely with the Germans during the real height of the economic crisis. We also have Ebrahim Rahbari, who's the director of European and Global Economics at Citigroup. And to my right, Frank Veneroso of Veneroso Associates. So let me start by asking Philippe to open up and do the big step back and tell us what's really going on here.
Thank you very much, Liz. I'm not sure I'm going to be very optimistic, but I try to be positive, and at least I'm very European. I've been working, as you said, at the French Ministry of Finance for several years. I was in charge of economic policies and European affairs. And I truly believe in Europe, and I think there's no alternative solution. So in that sense, probably I'm optimistic, I would say. I'm going to start with the main changes which happened in 2012. I think during this crisis there's been different phases, and the summer of 2012 has been a significant milestone. Then I will give you my view on the European economic outlook and the current economic situation, and then I will end up with looking at the different options which could help stabilizing the situation and avoid renewed tension. But let's start with the summer of 2012. Just before the summer, we were in a situation which was completely blocked. I would say that we were actually very close to a breakup of the euro. We had, financial markets were totally blocked, as I said. The economy was in the middle of a very deep recession again. And I think there was really a need to create a sort of positive shock. Otherwise, the risk was clearly a breakup of the euro. And there were actually at that time rumors and talks, and I can confirm that it was actually happening, about whether or not Greece would continue to be in the euro area. And especially there was some studies at the level of some governments and the Commission about the potential impact of a Greek exit. You probably remember this debate about the Greek exit. I think three decisions have completely changed the picture. The first one, I'm going to take them in a chronological order. The first one was at the end of June 2012, when European heads of states and government met in Brussels, and they decided something very important, which was to launch a process of more integration in the euro area, starting with the banking union. I have to say, I left the Ministry of Finance in France in May 2012. And at that time, the banking union was clearly not on the agenda, and in less than 2 months, the position had changed completely, and the French, in particular, were strong supporters of the banking union. I mean, the idea was clearly that there were some shortcomings in EMU. We had started to do monetary union, whereas monetary union should have come in the end. And there was a need to complement the monetary union with a true financial, fiscal, economic, and political union. It's a huge agenda. It's a very ambitious agenda, and it was actually at that time decided that the banking union was the priority, given the very negative feedback loop that was taking place between the risk in the banking sector and the sovereign crisis. So on June, I think it was 29th, I'm not so sure about the precise date, but European heads of state and government decided to launch a banking union, starting with a single supervision, you know the following, with a resolution mechanism, which is currently under discussion, and maybe one day, who knows, the single deposit guarantee scheme. But the idea is really to create the equivalent of FDIC in Europe. The second very important decision, and I think I would say the most powerful decision in the short run, has been the OMT. The central bank and Mario Draghi said that he would do whatever it takes to safeguard the euro, the integrity of the euro. And the OMT, even though it has not been triggered, even though it's still on the paper, has been the most powerful backstop since the beginning of this crisis, and it has completely changed the picture. The third factor, the third decision, which I think is also very important, was the decision. It's not something which has been announced officially. It's something which has been a decision which has been taken in closed doors, probably at night in Brussels, or in Berlin. But it's the decision eventually to keep Greece in the euro area and to continue to support Greece with a financial program, a third financial program, which was discussed and eventually agreed upon in December of the same year. Why was it so important? Because I think, and when I was at the French Ministry of Finance, I was clearly supporting this view. I think a Greek exit would have been probably the beginning of the end of the euro. If you consider that one country can exit, then it means that it's not a monetary union anymore. It's just a fixed exchange rate system, and the risk is to see some doubts about the other countries. If you leave Greece outside, why not Portugal? Why not Spain? Why not Italy? Why not France? And actually, even in France, I mean, people were wondering whether it was a good idea to have a monetary union reduced with only core countries, and what the impact would be on the economy of these countries, with some potential negative effects. So eventually, I think, even though in Germany many people were in favor of a Greek exit, Mrs. Merkel, I think, understood that the Greek exit was threatening the future of the euro, and threatening the future of the euro meant threatening the future of Europe. And we need to keep something in mind. Europe is not about economics. Europe is not about finance. Europe is about peace. Europe is something which has been launched after the Second World War to safeguard the peace on the continent. And, I mean, initially it was a community of coal and steel, and then we built up further integration, and then we came to the conclusion, which probably was premature, that we needed the monetary union. But the main purpose of Europe is really to create an area where peace would prevail forever. And I think this is what's been decided on that day, when eventually Mrs. Merkel took the decision to continue to support Greece and to convince her citizens that it was the best thing to do. It was in the interest of Europe. It was also in the interest of Germany. So with these three game changers, we've seen confidence coming back gradually in financial markets. It's not been quick. It's been a long process. There were a lot of people very skeptical about this solution. And we've seen gradually confidence coming back in the future of the euro, in the integrity of the euro, and financial markets started to improve. And this is what Draghi calls the reduction of fragmentation on the funding side. We've seen financial market working again in Europe. And very gradually, this has translated into better confidence in the real economy. And I think this is the reason why eventually the recession came to an end in the second quarter of 2013. On top of that, you need to keep in mind that the pace of austerity has been reduced somewhat, even though fiscal consolidation is still very high on the agenda. There's been a very useful discussion with the IMF, and I think the European Commission reviewed its position on fiscal policy multipliers, and I was amazed to listen to Mr. Rehn a couple of days ago, and the Commission explaining that in a situation of a very large recession, when everybody reduces its deficit in the same time, multipliers might be higher than what we initially thought. And as such, it was sort of acknowledgement that fiscal policy, which was decided in 2010, was maybe a mistake. But anyway, confidence went back, austerity eased somewhat, and we've seen the end of the recession. But the problem today is to know whether we have some growth driver, and I think we don't have growth driver, because the main impediments are still in place. Even though the pace of fiscal consolidation has been eased, fiscal consolidation is still a priority, and fiscal policy remains restrictive, and quite significantly restrictive, given the fact that it is restrictive everywhere in the same time. So, I mean, this is a constraint for household income due to higher taxes and lower public spending. Second, the prospect for private investment is still quite bleak. Okay, the future of Europe has been secured to a certain extent, but there are still some major imbalances. In some countries, the corporate sector is still very indebted and needs to continue to reduce its debt and to deleverage, and the banking sector is still in a difficult situation. Fragmentation has not been fully unwound, and there are some significant impediment in southern countries. I don't know whether we could talk about the credit crunch, because today the situation is more on the demand side, but should demand pick up, we might very quickly be in a position where credit supply would be a constraint. So there are some significant hurdles which remain in place. And if you look at the external sector, okay, and I'm going to talk about that. Imbalances have been reduced somewhat, competitiveness is improving, but this process is going to be very slow, very long, very painful. And anyway, if you look at growth at the global level, the prospect is not great. In the US, growth has resumed, but remains in the neighborhood of 2%, which is not really a good performance for the US economy. And in the US as well, there are some imbalances which needs to be reduced and which are going to be a drag on growth for several years. In Asia, I mean, in Japan, there's been some very artificial boost to the economy, but it's not going to last very long because given the size of the budget deficit, there will be a need at some point to consolidate public finance as well. And I think medium-term prospects for Japan are not great, also given demographic trends. And emerging markets, we suddenly realized last summer that emerging markets was not a safe haven, that there were some problems in some countries. I was surprised to see that at the IMF meeting, everybody was talking about the weak five after having talked about the big five 1 year earlier, which clearly shows that there are some imbalances also in emerging markets and growth is going to be constrained in many of them. So overall, global demand is expected to pick up, but to remain very modest compared with historical standards. So there is no growth driver, and I think the best we can expect is to see growth going back more or less close to potential growth, which is not very far from 1% in Europe. As I said, imbalances are receding. That's the good news, because I think at the beginning of the crisis, the focus was on fiscal policy and the fact that, okay, we are in such a bad situation because we've been running very bad fiscal policies and we've been running very high budget deficits. But actually, the main source of the crisis was not fiscal policy. It was macroeconomic imbalances and the fact that within the monetary union, if you don't have some mechanism to make sure that countries do not diverge, then you have some problems with some significant differences in real effective exchange rates. And so these imbalances have started to be reduced. There's been some reforms, very painful, which have been a drag on growth in the short run. But we see some improvement in competitiveness in many countries, including in Greece, even though it is a bit long to translate into higher exports. But we've seen some countries regaining market shares. It's the case of Spain in particular, but also to a certain extent Portugal. And the good news is that they regain market share outside Europe. But as I said, the bad news is that the short-term impact is very negative on domestic demand, and the rebound in export is not sufficient to balance that. So the outlook is quite bleak, and as Liz mentioned, risks are balanced, are skewed to the downside, and I think I can see only downside risk to this scenario of very modest recovery. First, the global outlook, of course. We could have another accident in the US. The budget situation has not been fixed. In emerging markets, even though the situation has improved lately, we can see renewed tension in some of them. Of course, the weakness of inflation is a big issue, in particular given the high stock of debt. Debt sustainability could be endangered because of the weakness of inflation and the possibility even of deflation in some countries, because the competitiveness adjustment at play means that prices are declining in many of these countries. I mean, you've probably seen the latest inflation numbers. Inflation is turning negative in many countries. It is negative in Greece. It's beginning to become negative in Spain, in Portugal. And so the risk is to see deflation spreading in peripheral countries. I mean, the other risk, which I think is quite severe, is a risk of another credit crunch next year. Next year, we're going to have a very important exercise, which is the asset quality review for the banking sector. And banks are going to focus on their balance sheet, on the quality of their balance sheet, on the size of their balance sheet, and in the meantime, they are not going to lend to the economy. At a time when we need credit to pick up, if we don't have a credit pickup, then we run the risk to see the recovery constrained by lack of financing. And last but not least, I think these policies had significant impact on the social situation. We've been mentioning that unemployment was running at a very high level in many countries. Can we continue in such an environment? I mean, this creates some political tensions. We're going to have elections at the European level to elect the European Parliament in next May, and I'm a bit concerned about the potential outcome of this election. Populist parties and extreme parties and anti-European parties are likely to gain ground, and it's not surprising when you see the social situation today. So these are risks which could also impact the economic situation. So I would like to finish on a more positive tone. What can we do? What can policymakers do in such an environment to stabilize the situation and avoid renewed tension? First of all, I think it's very important to speed up the banking union, because the financial fragmentation is really a risk for the outlook for southern countries, especially in a country like Italy. When you look at lending rates to the private sector and to the corporation sector, rates are still a lot higher than they are in France or Germany. And I think this clearly points to the fact that the monetary union does not work. So it's very urgent to speed up the banking union. As I said, 2014 is going to be a critical year due to the asset quality review. I think it's very urgent that member states agree on the second step, which is the resolution mechanism. They agree on backstops to put in place for the asset quality review, and they remove the risk of a credit crunch next year. The second important action, which is critical, and I think, I prepared this before yesterday, and I think yesterday the ECB proved that they were ready to act, is a support for monetary policy. I think the ECB rate cut yesterday, and the decision also to extend the full allotment procedure until mid-2015, which is for me even more important than the rate cut, is clearly the proof that the ECB is a bit nervous about the outlook for growth and price stability. Of course, their mandate is inflation, but with inflation at 0.7%, maybe you can consider that they are out of their mandate. So they have reacted quite significantly, and I think more action will be necessary, in particular in terms of liquidity provision, to make sure that liquidity accident does not happen. Third, and I think this is going to be more difficult and more controversial, I think we cannot get out of this situation without a significant debt relief in some countries. It's clearly the case in Greece, and I think it is on the agenda of European governments to discuss again debt relief measure once Greece has returned to a primary surplus, which is actually the case. But I think it's also important for Portugal, where the level of the debt is clearly now unsustainable given the very negative dynamic of nominal GDP. So I think these countries need debt relief. Maybe more countries will need debt relief. When I say debt relief, I keep it very open. Is it debt held by public creditors? Is it debt held by private investors? So do we need another PSI? With the danger that another PSI would clearly reopen the Pandora box and could run the risk to see renewed tension on many sovereign debts. But I think this is a very important topic to put on the agenda. Fourth, I think we need growth, and that's very clear. When you talk about debt sustainability, you talk about numerator, which is a debt, but the denominator, which is nominal GDP. Growth is, there's no miracle. I think growth cannot come back with traditional old policies with higher deficits and higher debt, but growth needs to come from an accelerated agenda for structural reforms. And when I talk about structural reforms, I'm not talking about peripheral countries only. I think structural reforms need to be on the agenda, even in countries like Germany and France, in order to boost demand also in these countries. And that's probably part of this rebalancing that many people are calling for. We also need a sensible plan for long-term public investment. This is something which has been discussed already in the framework of the Growth Compact, but the process is long, and I have to say I'm a bit skeptical about the efficiency, and I would like to see more in terms of agreement for boosting long-term investment. And last but not least, I think we need to deepen the integration in Europe, because the monetary union cannot work without a significant degree of economic, financial and political union. But for that, we need the involvement of European citizens. And this is the main problem today. If you ask in any country whether people are supporting European policies, they would say no, of course, because for them today, in many countries, Europe means lower wages, means higher poverty, higher unemployment. So we need to, I think European politicians need to understand that they need to reintroduce politics in the European debate. They need to take into account the well-being of their citizens, and they need to convince them that there is no future outside Europe. I mean, today, or maybe not today, but let's say in 10 years, no country in Europe would be part of the G7 if we were making the G7 today. So, I mean, we have giants emerging in the world, and we exist only all together. I mean, each country taken separately does not exist. My country, France, used to be very proud of its diplomacy, sovereignty, but I think even in France, we need to understand that we do not exist without the other countries, and that sovereignty is going to be saved only if it is shared with other countries. Otherwise, we are going to lose it anyway. So I'm going to stop here, and I hope we can have an interesting discussion afterwards.
Sure we will, especially since you use the term Pandora's box, which is exactly, I think, what your presentation was about. Ebrahim, what do you have to say about all of this, and particularly the issue of debt?
Yes, thank you very much, Liz. Thank you to the organizers for organizing this very interesting conference. Thank you all for coming here this morning. Now, you will actually hear quite a lot of agreement from me with Philippe's remarks, which is encouraging, of course, but it is also somewhat telling, because I think one of the problems we're facing in Europe is not really that sensible people don't agree on what the reasonable actions are, but the problems are in getting the people who are in charge to actually implement some of these reasonable actions. Now, I wanted to highlight in particular that I agree on one point very strongly with Philippe, and that's the importance of Europe and the importance of Europe as a unified project for all of the individual countries. Now, the point that I'm coming from is somewhat different from Philippe's, because it's because of my somewhat different biography. My parents came to Germany, as it were, from Iran many years ago, and I, after all of these years, have to say I had the privilege of growing up in Europe, compared to, I think, I think much more difficult fate that would have endured had my parents stayed back in the Middle East. That's, of course, something which is very, very visible in Greece, which is much closer to some of the instability that region has. But I want to say in the strongest terms that the idea that Europe as an idea and as a strategy resonates very strongly with me. Europe as an idea, because it came out of the Second World War, but hopefully durably has put to rest, I think, violent conflict in Europe. But as a strategy, because as Philippe highlighted, and as sometimes it's remarked, in Europe there are only small countries, those that already know it and those that have yet to find out that they are small countries. So in that sense, I think the basic starting point for any discussion about Europe should be that it is in the common interest for all of the European countries to drive this project forward, and that there's really almost no alternative for a prosperous future than to go down that route. Now let me turn to what is supposed to be the main content of my talk. Now I don't know whether I do have a few slides which are mostly for reference. But I want to focus on the importance of debt in particular, which is something that Philippe also already brought up. Now, I think that the existence of excessive debt is really a key issue in the current situation that we're facing, and that finding a resolution, finding a way to reduce these excessive levels of debt will be pretty much the only way we can ensure that Europe will be on that path to hopefully regain prosperity. Now, I really want to make 3 points in my presentation. One is that debt is bad, at high levels at least. Now, we've had a pretty lively discussion over the last 12 months or so based on some academic work that has been done by Reinhard, Rogov, and others. And that makes life easier. That discussion, I think, was somewhat unhelpful because I think it confused, I think, the very basic and intuitive point that debt can be the source of a lot of problems, and in particular in 2 ways. Debt, and I mostly speak of public and private sector debt, but on average leads to, high levels of debt lead to bad decision making. It's most obvious in the question of public debt. When you have very high levels of debt, they tend to go along with high levels of taxation. Taxation tends to be distortive, in particular tends to discourage investment. So your average growth rates do generally end up worse as a result. But probably more importantly, high levels of debt are a major source of potential financial instability. Now, that's no news to people at the Levy Institute and people familiar with Hyman Minsky's work. So it's very much in line with, I think some of the main topics of this conference. But it highlights that in the presence of very high levels of debt, confidence is key. Confidence alone, the absence of confidence, the lack of confidence, can shift us from a situation where I think a situation looks very manageable to, I think, the sort of panics and lack of trust that we endured not too long ago in Europe. It feels like a long time ago. It really is only a few months back. Now, the second point is that debt makes all of the other problems that we're facing in Europe, and there's still quite a lot, as Philippe also already mentioned, all the much more worse. So we have a number of issues. A lot of these would be much more manageable if we had less debt. And then, if debt is the problem, austerity, as we all surely know, isn't the full answer. And unfortunately, there's no silver bullet. So we will need a range of them. So let me just very briefly highlight why I think that debt is too high in Europe. And in this chart, by comparison, you see a number of countries, both public and private sector debt here, except for the financial sector, for all sorts of technical reasons. Now, there's, as you can see, lots of variability between countries. The one thing that they have in common is that levels of non-financial sector debt over the last couple of decades have gone up in almost every country. Germany is a bit of an outlier, but in all of the countries, not just in Europe, but certainly within Europe as well, we have seen levels of public and private sector debt shoot up quite substantially since around 1980 or so. Now, I highlight again the distinction between public and private sector debt sometimes matters quite a lot. But one of the things we've learned from this crisis is that that distinction at the end of the day isn't all that clear. That does migrate from public to private balance sheets or the other way around, depending on where I think the vulnerability is greatest at that point. If you look at this picture and we don't find a way to at least reverse some part of the decline in coming years, I think we're going to be in a very difficult situation, and that's surely one of the main reasons why downside risks are still more prominent in Europe. Now, what are the problems? What are other problems in Europe that haven't yet been fixed? And first among them surely is an employment or a labor market problem. Now, on this slide on the left-hand side, very familiar to many of you, of course, I suspect, are the unemployment figures for a number of European countries. Distressingly high, of course, in many countries, of course, notably in Greece. And this is one of the many ways in which I think some of the problems we have created in the last few years may well have a very long memory. So we have made progress, and I think Philippe highlighted some of the major items of progress that we have achieved. But at the same time, we have created new problems. Long-term unemployment, very high levels of unemployment, higher levels of inequality are surely among them. And it isn't a problem that is very easy to solve, again, particularly at the level of individual nation states. The right chart on this slide shows you some data from the OECD about levels of educational achievement in a number of European countries. And what you see there is that in quite a few countries, the level even of higher secondary level education or basic university level education is very low. Here in this chart, Portugal and Spain stand out. Greece is pretty high too. But it's really a fairly common problem, and a problem that's not even necessarily European. What we've learned over the last decade or two is that probably because of technological change, probably because of some other factors that are driving divergence within countries, particularly low-skilled people find it difficult to find employment at sort of competitive levels of remuneration. That's something that we sort of know how to deal with, and the issue is that the way to deal with it often is only through subsidizing employment for the lowly productive in the economy. And the problem, of course, in many of the southern European countries is that there simply isn't enough money to subsidize them. So this looks like a fairly intractable problem for the South in particular, and it could become one of the most important looking ahead. So we really do need to find a way to get levels of unemployment down, and it seems fairly difficult to achieve that while maintaining these very high levels of debt and service debt. Now, another issue which we still haven't fixed by any means is the banking sector. Now, on the chart itself, it's really just to highlight that sovereign exposure of European banks has shot up dramatically, not just generally sovereign exposure, of course, but exposure to the domestic sovereign. So both levels of exposure to governments in general, crowding out other forms of funding, but then in particular the entrenchment of fragmentation that came along with it are big issues. Now, there are major developments in the process, as Philippe noted. Banking union is, again, very important as an idea. I think some of the progress is very notable. But there is, I think, a valid suspicion that it won't be nearly as effective as it really could be, and it hopefully would be in order to address the issue of a lack of funding and a divergence of funding costs and funding opportunities in much of Europe. And then a third issue is that I think one particular problem we're having in Europe is that there really isn't a whole lot of scope for the sort of deep integration that makes a lot of these problems go away over the next few years. Now, what I show in this chart is some of the data from a recent survey by the Pew Institute, which asked citizens in different European countries, and I'm sure some of you have come across this before, which countries do you trust more and which countries do you trust a little bit less? And I think while this is clearly only a snapshot of the picture, it is really quite telling in some respects. In one respect, that the polls seem to be obsessed with Germany because they tend to answer Germany to every question they're asked. But I do think another issue which is very telling is the lack of trust at this point between many European countries. The lack of trust in the core, in the creditor countries, to debtor countries. But similarly, I think a valid sense that the debtor countries think that they're misunderstood and to some extent wrongly blamed for some of the problems that exist now in the Eurozone, which by all accounts everybody has contributed. Now this is a snapshot, but actually the main reason I put this up is because this should make you very cautious about calls that deeper integration, deeper political integration, deeper fiscal integration is going to be the answer to the Eurozone's problems in the next couple of years. I said at the outset, I strongly believe in the European idea and in a strategy to further Europe, but it just really isn't very likely to happen for another couple of years. We need to build, I think, a lot of understanding within populations in individual countries and across European countries in order to drive that integration agenda forward. And in the meantime, I think we need to build in circuit breakers, if you like. We need to find ways to build resilience into the system which allow us to deal with the problems that we have without actually having to call necessarily for much deeper levels of integration. And I think this is especially important, as was already indicated, for the upcoming year. And probably, to be honest, if we arrive at this point next year, I will probably say the same thing for the year after. 2014 is crucial. We have the European elections. We have a number of follow-up bailout programs that are due to be agreed. We have a new government. We will hopefully at some point have a new government in Germany, which will hopefully manage to communicate its idea of where Europe goes to its own population, in particular, strongly. But even if we take an optimistic projection of some of these developments, it still doesn't turn us away from the basic conclusion of this chart, which is deep European integration. It really isn't going to be something to happen in the next few years. Now, these three, I think, big issues: a banking sector which isn't fixed yet, a labor market situation which is seemingly intractable when really it is only intractable if you respect the current budget constraints of some of the southern European countries, and then probably the lack of scope for deep integration in Europe over the next few years. All of these problems are very severe, but they would be much more manageable if debt burdens were much lower. The problem with that, as I said, is it makes you vulnerable to crisis of confidence. And these three problems suggest that it will be very difficult for Europe to durably produce confidence over the next few years. That means that we will remain exposed to the types of volatility that we have already witnessed. We've made some institutional progress, but the fact that we have very high levels of debt both constrains the financial wriggle room for countries to respond to some of these issues, but it also leaves you vulnerable to the procyclicality that financial flows are almost intrinsically associated with. So having high and excessive levels of debt really is a key part which makes the European puzzle of problems so difficult to solve. Now, what about ways from here? And again, you will see that my views mirror those of Philippe fairly closely. Let me first rule out, of course, the things that by now we know don't work. And I don't quite buy into this whole idea that, oh, fiscal multipliers turned out to be a lot higher than expected. There are, I think, a number of people here in the audience that are very fully aware that we all knew that fiscal multipliers would be very high back in 2009 or 2010. Can't vouch for that all policymakers necessarily knew. There was a fairly steep learning curve, I think, on the economic and financial side in a number of areas. But people that have ever looked at this question, we all knew that recessions imply high fiscal multipliers. Maybe for various reasons they turned out to be even worse, but we always knew that fiscal policy would be, or fiscal retrenchment would be a very bad way, particularly for Europe as a whole, but also in individual countries, to respond to some of the debt dynamics, some of the looming debt dynamics at the time. Now, the problem is we don't have a silver bullet to solve, I think, the European problems as a whole, but the debt problem in particular. What that means at the end of the day is that we have to resort to use a range of tools. Fiscal policy has its part to play, at least in the negative sense that we should make sure that at the height of depression, we don't add to the problems by imposing further austerity. Maybe there are ways to consolidate your finances with a sort of longer horizon, but now is not quite the time. Monetary policy, and I think that's what I focus on the charts on this slide, clearly has a role to play, and we're all encouraged by the fact that the ECB sort of did a reasonable thing yesterday. But what these pictures highlight to you is that over the last year or so, it mostly hasn't. I mean, there's a lot more for monetary policy to potentially add to solving these problems. Again, by itself, it can't do it, but clearly there's a lot more that the ECB could do to at least make the monetary financial environment somewhat more susceptible to being solved. But it doesn't stop there. I think when your problem are excessive levels of debt, bringing down those levels of debt in sort of in the discontinuous fashion has to be one of the priorities. Debt relief was mentioned, and I think debt relief is key. The problem is, of course, how do you engineer it? I do want to point again to the fact that it's not just the public debt that we're concerned about, it's private debt as well. In a range of the southern periphery countries, we now have, or we have had for a long time, but we continue to have high levels of private debt in the corporate sector and the household sector, which weigh on the prospects for the recovery. We have to clearly delineate our options for dealing, of course, with debt on the sovereign side as well. The political calculus is very different from the economic one. We know that debt overhang at the sovereign level is an enduring drag on economic activity. So let's find a way to deal with that excess level of debt in a more or less transparent way. Transparent to investors, but also transparent to populations. Now, pretty tall order, I admit up front, but nevertheless, clearly absolutely a priority for policymakers. And then that still leaves, and I left it last but not least, but it still leaves a number of issues which are mostly for politicians to address in the areas of structural reform, in the areas of taking populations with them. I already highlighted, I think Germany's role in that perspective is of course very important, but again, it is a more encompassing task to be set for Europe as a whole. In every country, we need to be very clear what Europe means to one country, to every citizen to some extent. And we also need to be very clear what we want out of Europe, what we want from Europe, and what we're ready to give to Europe over the next few years. Now you see there's really not the prospect for the situation in Europe to be dealt with anytime soon. So my optimism to some extent is modest, and my call for action relatively urgent. We are, I think, in the relatively comfortable position that at least financial markets have stopped panicking about I think the prospects of some European countries, and that has made life a little bit easier, but of course it has also made life in some ways too comfortable for policymakers to address some of the underlying dynamics. As I said, and as I started out with, Europe is probably the only future for individual European countries, and I think to reach that future we need to find a way to reduce debt levels sustainably. So let me stop here. I'm sure we'll have plenty to discuss.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, thank you, Ebrahim, for that. I mean, clearly you identified and drilled down into the Achilles heel here. And Frank, why don't you take things further in your discussion?
Don, can I use that? Are these on? Okay. Well, I'm just going to amplify on what my colleagues have said. So, very quickly, I'm not talking about Greece because that's special and it complicates things. I'm not talking about fiscal policy. I'm only talking about debt and financial dynamics. There are two financial dynamics. There was a run on the European banking system in 2012, and that created a recession. That has stopped, but we still have a lot of debt. As a result, there is still a chance for a financial crisis, but of a different sort. If it happens, we'll have a run. Let me just, here's an abstract, and I'll read it because I think that we won't have time to go through all of this in any detail. Okay, basically, what happened in 2012 was that there is a fatal flaw in the euro. And that is that there is a risk to a depositor if there's a euro exit. There's the risk of a loss on currency above everything that would happen in a national banking system. So when the threat of euro exits occurred, people started to run. And that created financial constraints and a panic. That panic was solved through expectations management by Draghi. And as a result, the aftermath of that occurred in the winter, and we had a recession, but the financial conditions improved, and so this spring we saw green shoots. Now all of a sudden those green shoots are turning brown, and we don't know why. And the reason why is because debt levels, private debt levels, have not come down at all. And the fact that they have not come down at all means they are putting a different kind of pressure independent of the run on the private sector. And we see this in the data. Now, if inflation goes down, which it has done, and if we have deflation, we then will have Minsky-Fisherian debt deflation dynamics, which will make things worse, not better. That is really what the issue is today, and that is why I think Draghi acted the way he did yesterday. So I'm going to go very, very quickly through what happened year by year. Okay, here's that fatal flaw in the euro as described by Pisani-Ferry, and you can read it in my PowerPoint. Here's the bank run. These are target 2 balances. Money is leaving the weak countries, going to the strong countries. The deposit run potential was huge, and the economy immediately started to react. These are 3 measures of retail sales when that occurred, down. And there was panic in the air everywhere, okay? Then came Mario. If you know America Mad Magazine, you understand why I put that there. You probably don't. Okay, so there was a panic, peripheral yields soared, and the bank run caused deposits to run off in Spain and elsewhere. And then Mario came out with the OMT, and we will do whatever it takes. And it's amazing the impact. And the way we really see that is not only did the peripheral yields come down, but there was a big pressure on the euro. And it was speculative shorting. And this was an enormous event. We never saw anything like this in a currency. And as a result of what happened, the euro bounced, and the ECB also, that decline is its net foreign assets. It had huge external swaps, which helped out. So there was a lot of expectations management here, along with liquidity support, and the bank run reversed, and we see this in target 2 reversing, and so he succeeded basically in ending a financial panic that was associated with a fatal flaw in the euro. In the winter, we still had the credit effects, and so the economies did badly. I don't have a pointer, but the low point here is a 5%, 10% decline in industrial production in Spain, retail sales in Spain. These are just huge numbers. All across Europe, retail sales are falling. Even in Germany, retail sales are falling. And then came the Cyprus crisis, and there we had depositors having to take hits, and that set up the possibility that we would have new round of runs. So it was very, very dark at the time of the Cyprus crisis, and then just amazingly out of nowhere, there came the green shoots. This, industrial production in Portugal, amazing, out of nowhere. Here is German retail sales turning up. Here's industrial production in the Netherlands, a big bounce. Here's Spanish retail sales, a big bounce. Here's sentiment across the board, up. Why? Because financial conditions have changed thanks to Mario. So we have loans bounce, we have yields come down, we have the money supply increase, and we have target 2 reverse. So why did it happen? Financial conditions. Part it was austerity fatigue. I think there's less austerity in Spain. And whenever you have a very, very, very deep recession, there's always a tendency for the economy, any economy, to rebound, at least for a while. So that's what happened. But now suddenly the green shoots are turning brown. So even in Germany, retail sales are negative. The industrial production really isn't taking off. Factory orders did nothing for 6 months, though they just bounced. Look at this employment data. It's the worst employment data. This is increase in employment in Germany, even relative to 2012. And in France, we've had 3 months down in industrial production. And so here, consumer spending is still negative, and even the job data has not improved by that much. Italy is terrible, retail sales going absolutely nowhere, industrial production very negative, and employment. It looked like it was getting better. All of a sudden in September, a huge increase in a decline in employment. Netherlands data across the board is very bad. Only Spain. Spain continues to do better. I'm amazed by it. Just look at that. That's real retail sales, still taking off. Look at this employment data in the latest month in Spain. A tremendous surge. So Spain is an outlier. I do not know why. Okay. Now we get to our problem of debt. Why is this happening? If we look at this data, you can look at it in a PowerPoint later, you'll see that private non-financial debt in Europe is very high relative to other countries. And it has not come down. Here it is for Eurozone overall as a percentage of GDP. We've gone through all this, and the ratio has barely come down. It's true for companies as well as for households. So there's a big debt burden, and inflation is falling. And when inflation falls, debt hurts more. Inflation expectations are falling. And we know that if we go into deflation with this level of debt, there's going to be a renewed crisis because real indebtedness will start to rise. The money supply, which had improved, is starting down. The broader money supply, even more so. And this is the key chart of them all. Private credit growth is more negative than at any time in the whole cycle. Why? In part, we see the ECB balance sheets down, but that's mostly target 2. It may be that policy is making things worse, as we are now trying to make the banks more restrictive and responsible. And Basel III capital rules are progressively, perhaps, making the situation worse. But the real problem may simply be too much debt and bad demographics. Now, here's the Minskian a twist. Expectations management, for the most part, is what ended the panic and turned things around. There is still no system-wide deposit insurance, and that is the fatal flaw in the euro. There is still a vulnerability to runs. That vulnerability seems to be past, but if there is a price deflation and the burden of debt becomes more painful, it may come back. Another question is, why is Europe's debt so high? And Jan Kregel basically explained this to me. The welfare state, by putting support under income, fostered a pervasive moral hazard that probably distorted the risk protections of lenders and borrowers. And this idea that moral hazard through government interventions would foster greater portfolio plunging and higher debt was an idea that High came out with in stabilizing an unstable economy. And it seems to me this may have happened in a huge way in Europe. Now, Europe has been chipping away at the welfare state supports. And to the extent that it does that, it is undermining the behaviors that made people willing to lend and made people willing to borrow. So if you change the perception of the welfare state support, but you still have the debt legacy, you have a kind of very untenable situation. And it is my hypothesis that it's this untenable, growing untenable situation from a behavioral point of view that may be an insidious force in Europe for price deflation that Europe may not be able to withstand. This may be what is behind falling inflation expectations, and more so, declining real private debt. And if that's true, then we still have a problem. Thank you.
Frank, thanks to all of you. That was definitely not quite as optimistic as I think a lot of us had hoped to hear, but definitely you know, a splash of cold water on a lot of pronouncements that we've heard recently that things are getting brighter and that the worst is over. I mean, Frank and all of you actually, if anything, it seems to me that you identified some significant new risks that Europe will be facing. in the future. And, you know, you talked about the possibility of a new crisis. Do you both also think that a new type of crisis could possibly unfold here in Europe in the coming years, based on everything you all just talked about?
Well, first thing, I think it's clear the crisis is not over. And when I heard Mr. Schäuble and President Hollande saying that the crisis was over, I was terrified, I have to say. Because when you think the crisis is over, you tend to think that you don't have to act anymore. And what we've seen is that Europe is moving forward only in terms of stress. And I think we will need more stress to have more reforms and more decisions taken. So definitely, I think I would like to make sure that the time of stress is over, but I think there will be some stress. I mean, there are many events in 2014 which are susceptible to renew the pressure in financial markets, or in, as I said, also in the social situation is still very unstable and might be the trigger for renewed tensions. I mean, I think you mentioned, Ebrahim, the question of program countries which are going to end next year. I think that's the main issue. What's going to happen in Portugal? Portugal is under program only until May next year. We all know that Portugal will not be in a position to re-access market, and then there will be a need for another program. Another program means additional funds, probably also, as I said, debt relief, because the debt sustainability of Portugal is clearly not so secured. And so discussions at that time will renew on which sort of debt relief, a PSI and OSI, and I think this is the possible trigger for renewed tensions. Tensions can also come from outside Europe. I mean, let's keep that in mind. I mean, I was amazed sometimes when I go to the US that many investors tell me in Europe you don't know how to take decisions, and your policy makers are very unstable, and they can't agree. But this is the same in the US. You don't need to have 17 different countries for that. When you look at the debate on the budget, I mean, clearly nothing has been resolved. We just have a bit more time for a solution, but this debate will re-emerge, and we might have an accident. I hope not, but if there is an accident on that in the US, of course the impact on Europe will be quite big. I also mentioned that I was a bit worried about Japan. I think we all focus on the debt problem in Europe, but what about the debt problem in Japan? After 10 years of deflation or even more, public debt, gross debt above 250% of GDP, demographic trends which are just a disaster. I mean, unlike in Europe, I think demographics will not be corrected in Japan with immigration. So, I mean, the future of this country is a bit worrying. The Abenomics are sensible if you have the three pillars, but what about the third pillar? We are all talking about structural reforms and the lack of structural reforms everywhere, and especially in Europe, but Europe is the only place in the world where there has been some significant structural reforms undertaken over the last couple of years. As I said, maybe now Germany and France need also to do so, but in southern countries, the reforms which have been undertaken over the last 4 or 5 years are just amazing. And so just to say that outside Europe there are some risks as well, and this could be the trigger for renewed tension in Europe. But I would like to hear what my colleagues have to say on that.
Well, I mean, it probably won't come as a surprise to you that I very much agree that there's certainly risk for the crisis to return, and whenever I hear these policymaker statements that the crisis was over, it reminds me of what former U.S. President Bush said on that aircraft carrier in Iraq with the big banner of mission accomplished. I think way before I think there was any hope of getting to a stable situation there. Now, I think that the nature of the drivers of the crisis are shifting, and I agree mostly with Frank there in the sense that clearly we are at bigger risk of sustained deflation now in the euro area, which makes the sort of the real debt burden issue even greater than it was before. The pain that high unemployment in particular and long enduring austerity imposes is also cumulative. So again this is a problem which gets bigger over time, just as maybe other factors in Europe have become slightly smaller. Current account deficits, the reliance on external flows in different forms. So the nature of the risks is clearly evolving, but I think that the risk for the crisis to return is still very high. Now, I wanted to briefly also comment on that comparison with the US and Japan, and sort of backward looking, because one of the potential counter arguments to my and to some extent also Frank's speech was that there are these other countries which have similarly high, if not higher, levels of public debt. But at least in a backward-looking way, the situation was very different. It was very different for different reasons. In Japan, you had a sort of institutionalized home bias, which in Europe doesn't quite exist at the country level to the same extent. So you had almost all of Japanese sovereign debt is held domestically, very high levels of private savings, large current account surpluses over many, many years. And that was a very natural shield against, I think, that these debt problems to actually manifest themselves in any type of crisis. In a forward-looking manner, different issue. I share Philippe's concerns that I think that the Japanese situation could become very, very problematic in a number of years as soon as that dynamic somehow breaks down either because home buyers falls or because private savings become too small to actually be an efficient counterweight. The US is a slightly different situation, but it's simply the case that for now, when people worry about because of things in the US or because of things happening elsewhere in Europe, they don't take their money out of the US. They put their money back into the US to some extent. So you have this funny exorbitant privilege that the US still enjoys, and it's true that the US Congress is doing its utter best to destroy that confidence, but for now it still exists. But for these two countries, it's therefore much easier to sustain levels of debt, in particular to sustain the risk of panic than it is in Europe, where even though at the euro area level we don't rely on foreign money to a large degree, it's very easy for people to shift money from one euro area country to the next. And that's what we saw, of course, for a long period of time. That's one of the reasons why the target 2 balances shot up, as Frank highlighted. So the situation isn't quite comparable in terms of debt levels across countries. The risk is higher in Europe, and that means also we may find ourselves in a much more stressful situation at a point in the not-too-distant future.
Frank, if you want to respond to that, and then we would like to open it up to the audience for questions, so please raise your hand so that people can come around and give you a microphone.
Well, you're asking me for a forecast, and that's what I do. And my forecasting record on Europe has been just terrible. I didn't see the severity of what happened in 2012 because I didn't appreciate this fatal flaw in the euro that would make it so prone to bank runs. Then once that happened, last winter when the data was so bad, and we had the Cyprus crisis and the fact that depositors had to suffer, I shared George Soros's opinion that this was a template that should trigger a renewed round of deposit runs in Europe, and so things wouldn't get better. And of course, they miraculously got better. And I looked at the data, and I followed the data, and I said, well, something's happening here. It must be that somehow it's the end of austerity. You start to reduce fiscal restriction, and economies should get better. And so just at the time I'm convincing myself of that, all of a sudden these green shoots start to turn brown. And we see industrial production fall in France, and the numbers in Italy look terrible. And of course, one has to look once again for why one was wrong. And what one sees is that private credit is contracting, and faster than at any point in time. So what I gave you is a hypothesis. It seems to me that what Mario Draghi is aware of and was aware of yesterday, and what I guess we should be aware of, is that the private debts are still sky high, and there are forces, independent of fiscal policy, independent of all these structural reforms, all the granularity of policy and so forth and so on, that might be now weighing on behavior and demand. That's just a hypothesis. I'm a little worried about it.
All right, Philippe, a quick response, and then the gentleman in the back with the white shirt can ask the first question.
Yes, I don't fully share your view on the fact that there's been some green shoot and that they are turning brown. I've never seen the green shoot, I have to say. I think, as I said, the recession ended up, but there's no growth driver, and so what we're going to see is just some ups and downs. And so green shoot, brown shoots, maybe, I don't know, but at least I don't see any significant growth driver. And I think there's been a lot of excitement, especially about Spain. And I've read in many newspapers, or I've heard many analysts saying that Spain was the new miracle. I think there are still several years of adjustment in Spain, and I don't think there is any miracle over there. So we should be very careful. I mean, I meet, in my job, I meet a lot of investors everywhere in the world. A bit more than 6 months ago, I was presenting my scenario, which is exactly the same as today, and everybody was telling me, you're crazy, you are too optimistic, the recession will never end in Europe. And today, the same people tell me, you are too pessimistic, you are boring. So yeah, I'm boring maybe, but I'm sorry, that's what I think. And another thing on inflation and deflation, I think the problem of inflation is not something only in Europe. I mean, we have a very weak inflation environment at the global level for two reasons. The first one is that there's a huge slack in the economy at the global level. As I said, the debt problem does not concern only Europe, but all advanced countries. And so growth is going to be constrained everywhere for several years. And we just realized over the summer that there are also some imbalances in emerging market countries. So there's a slack in the economy, plus there is, I mean, some uncertainties about the outlook for energy prices, but there are some possibility that oil prices are going to decline further given the decline in geopolitical tensions, especially with Iran maybe coming back in the club of producing countries. So I think we need to be very careful about the fact that it's not a European problem, it's a global problem. The problem in Europe is that on top of that, we do some price adjustment in certain countries. And so we increase even more the risk of deflation. I mean, this adjustment would take place in a much better way if global inflation was 2 points higher. If inflation in Germany, I mean, Germany, you have full employment, wages are accelerating, and inflation is still very weak, and that's not normal. Inflation should be a lot higher in Germany, but because of this weak inflationary environment at the global level, the adjustment is much more difficult.
Thank you. Could you please identify yourself and ask a quick question?
My name is George Ganzias, and I'm a professor at the University of the Aegean. The thing is, I agree with whatever you have said, but I disagree on one thing. For me, the most important problem is not the debt, is the digital technology, because creates unemployment, the digital technology because creates unemployment, and about the Bitcoin. What do you think about the Bitcoin? Do you concerned about the Bitcoin, about this changing structure in the established banking system? That's my question.
The question is about I guess, the importance or the significance of the rise of the Bitcoin amid this situation. I don't know, you could give a quick response. And then please also raise your hands, other members of the audience, if you would like to ask a question.
Sure. Okay, so, well, just a quick response. Clearly not my area of utmost competency, but I mean, digital technology isn't the problem. I mean, I'm a big believer in technological progress, but it does create challenges for us to take all of the economy with us. I mean, the chart that I showed you that there are significant parts of the population that will find it harder to adjust. And one of the fallacies I think that many people have fallen into recently, particularly in Spain, is they look at some parts of the economy that are adjusting, and there are flexible parts, there are competitive parts, there are exporters in Spain in particular that have done pretty well. They look at indicators that reflect that, such as unit labor costs, and they forget that there are these others that are left behind and that find it much harder to adjust, much harder to change industry, job, maybe location even to some extent. So the challenge there is not to restrict, of course, the development or the diffusion of technology. The challenge is to create conditions for these people to be gainfully employed. And I guess the downside to that is we probably do have to subsidize some of these people for a long time. And that's, by the way, also what happened in most countries that went through these very big labor market adjustment periods, including in Germany. There was always a mix of incentives, but there was a big subsidy element to lower wage workers at the time. And on the Bitcoin side, I guess it's natural to lose a little bit of faith in your monetary system when it's undergoing such existential troubles as the euro is. But the Bitcoin phenomenon is, to some extent, it's global in the sense that I think actions by central banks across the world have I think made somewhat of a dent in the faith of the underpinning of your currency. I personally don't consider it as much of a risk. I think we should almost go the other way. When it comes to the ECB, we saw Draghi's action yesterday, and it's sort of a nice sign that they're alive, but it's nowhere near enough. I mean, we need central banks still to work against and to resist these deflationary or disinflationary pressures, particularly in the Eurozone. We will have to press institutions like the ECB, or the ECB in particular, to undertake much further, much wider-ranging measures. And if the cost of that is a little bit of not too much, a little bit lower faith in the underpinning of your monetary policy and your fiat currency, that's probably a risk worth taking.
Okay, interesting question, interesting response. We've got a few minutes left before our next panel, please.
My question is, Germany is going to introduce a Mindestlohn, the minimum wage, and they expect to export about 1 million jobs to other European countries through this procedure. In your opinion, is this not enough, or is it an inadequate policy response to the problems?
I think, I mean, I'm not sure it's going to answer exactly your question, but there's been a lot of pressure over the last couple of years on Germany to boost its domestic demand and to take part in the rebalancing. And these pressures have come from the IMF, from the OECD. I think it's going to come very soon also from the European Commission. Next week, the European Commission is going to issue some assessment on economic policies undertaken in different countries. For the first time, this is part of the two-pack regulation, which is improving coordination in the euro area countries. And the Commission is going to insist on the fact that Germany is running an imbalance, which is an excessive current account surplus, and therefore needs to boost its domestic demand. So, of course, the introduction of the minimum wage in the short run is going to boost domestic demand. It's going also to change significantly the functioning of the labor market in Germany, and it's going to maybe to have some impact on employment in other countries. But I don't think it's the best way to boost domestic demand in Germany. I think what Germany needs maybe is to use a little bit its fiscal policy. I mean, the budget is balanced, the structural deficit is balanced, even possibly in surplus. I mean, it's still very difficult to have a clear view on the output gap and the structural deficit. So fiscal policy could be used a little bit. And I think, as I said, Germany has not done structural reform over the last 10 years. I mean, since the Schröder reforms, nothing has been made. And there are some significant reforms to undertake in Germany to free up the non-traded goods sectors. And I think this is something which would be more positive in the long run for the European economy.
One more question from the audience? Yes, sir.
My name is George Thomaidis. I'm a resident psychiatrist in the Psychiatric Hospital of Thessaloniki, and I'm working on the rise of suicides in Greece. I would like to ask, there is one of the speakers spoke about the rise of populist parties in the European Union, and another one about the necessity of political determination about the decisions that are going to become necessary in the future. I would like to ask, in Greece, there is a public perception that the IMF and the European Union have pressed the government to take decisions that targeted the incomes of the lower classes and had a tremendous impact in the internal market of the country. Do you believe that there should be a new kind of policy that would target more the highest incomes in the European countries so that the people could feel less stressed, the common people, I mean, and find a way to receive the necessary, let's say, the necessary amounts of money that are necessary to boost recovery in some European countries like Greece, who do not, where there are no money left in the average citizen to help the creation of a balanced budget for the state.
Thank you. Frank, would you like to take that?
I'm happy to say something, and maybe if you...
Yeah.
I think this is very sensible what you said. I mean, the Troika had never said to Greece or to any other countries to put the burden on the poorest people. I think it was up to all governments to decide what to do in terms of tax increases or spending cuts. But the perception that the burden has not been fairly distributed is clear, and I think this is true, and this is one of the big dangers. I mean, we have some imbalances to correct. We need to make sure that this is fairly distributed. Otherwise, of course, the reaction is going to be a rejection. How can you accept Europe if Europe means for you lower wages, higher unemployment, lower standards of living? And I understand that people are looking for alternative solutions. So that's why it's so important that to make sure that the burden of this adjustment is fairly distributed, because otherwise, politically, it's going to become a big problem.
Okay.
I also just wanted to add to that, and my father is also a psychiatrist, so I have a lot of sympathy for the points that you made. I think at the end of the day, a lot of it comes back to we have to create jobs, and ultimately that may mean, well, we have to subsidize jobs. So I think a big part of the solution of the problem is that we do have to shift some of the burden towards those that are able to carry it. And again, I mirror Philippe's thoughts. But as Philippe also said, I don't think you can necessarily pin the blame on the Troika. I think the unbalanced nature of a lot of the reform programs has many people to blame, but I think domestic governments played a big and unfortunate role.
Well, clearly, issues of equality and fairness are huge ones that the Eurozone must face down going forward. We're going to get ready for our next panel. If I could just ask each of you one very quick question in 2 sentences. If you would put on your hat or look into your crystal ball, where do you see the Eurozone, the economic state of the Eurozone, and particularly the southern countries 5 years from now? Just a 2-sentence reaction, and then we'll go.
I left my crystal balls at home, so I'm afraid I can't give you the clear answer. But I want to finish on a more optimistic note. I think the adjustment is going to be long and painful. It's going to last several years, but I think in the end, Europe is moving forward, and I would say I'm more optimistic about the prospect for 10 years from now than for next year.
Well, I took my crystal ball with me. I'm not sure it's very useful, but let me use a comparison sometimes from personal lives. Sometimes when personal relationships break up, they say that it takes roughly half the time that the relationship lasted for you to get over it. So if you use that analogy, in Europe we had a 15-year or so credit-driven boom. We started in 2009 or so in the crisis. So hopefully in 5 years' time we're just about over it.
I'd go along with that. Also, we can't forecast 5 years, but one thing we do know from history is that when economies underperform hugely for a very long time, there turns in a big way, and it's just the nature of depressed economies that somehow or other 5 years later they wind up being better than almost anyone thinks.
Great, thank you so much, and let's thank these gentlemen for giving their expert opinion. Everybody will be available for questions, and we look forward to our next panel.